Good morning, everyone. If you see me fiddling here, it's because I'll be fiddling. I'm told that I'm going to have to do it the old way of pressing the arrows up and down. So I'm going to have to learn some of the things that I have started to unlearn. But I really want to thank the organizers, the Free Market Foundation, for the invitation, which I must admit it took me quite a long time to respond and accept, because we, in a very difficult time in terms of planning for the next financial years and the next cycle of planning. So I wasn't even sure if I should confirm that I'll be coming here, but ultimately the emails that were coming from Jason were just unbearable. I decided at some point to say, no, I'm going to be coming. But I really want to indicate here that I think a lot has been said about property rights, and there's a whole range of property rights that we can talk about, even though this presentation of mine will be focusing on intellectual property. And a whole lot of time when people start talking about intellectual property, people think of patents. They got a relationship. Intellectual property is not patents, but patents are intellectual property. So you got different forms of intellectual properties, and the critical thing about intellectual property is that we always say intellectual property is not there as a decoration. Intellectual property is generated in order to create benefit. It is there in order to be exploited. And I will really sort of highlight some of the things that we have started to do in the country, especially insofar as the intellectual property from the publicly funded R&D is concerned. I don't even know how it operates.
Sorry, let me go and look for the person who could probably fix this. I was looking around for him and couldn't find him.
And when I do this, I realize it is not working. Okay.
Mr. Muofhe, I'm going to beg on you to raise your voice.
That's fine. So if you don't hear me, please just raise your hand. So I think we therefore have to ask ourselves why IP, and we also need to then say, in terms of how we're driving it, we know that there are a number of reasons why people will really follow and ensure that IP is utilized or is exploited. But from our point of view, the drive is mainly around ensuring that we support technological advancement, and that we are able to, when it comes to the IP that has been supported through publicly funded sources, that we do not have a situation where IP is funded, supported, and it lies somewhere in the shelves. And of course, we want to make sure that there is socio-economic impact. Now, okay. You are not seeing what I'm seeing in the screen.
Maybe you have to describe it to some degree.
Okay. So I don't know if we got a mic issue and now we got the projection issue. So basically the issue around IP is that we need to be able to generate, protect, and also make sure that the IP is utilized. So that's really the underlying thing. Now, in terms of the why we actually chase the protection of IP, is because we have, and we already know that a number of economies In fact, some people estimate that 50 to 80% of economic growth globally is based on innovation and new knowledge. And that prosperous society require economic and social prosperity. Innovation alone is not the answer, and that is very crucial. So while we are punting the issue of IP and innovation, we know that there has to be a number of other inbuilt mechanisms to ensure that.
Sorry for interrupting. Just what number are you at?
We can start here.
Start here. Okay.
Yeah.
Just sorry about that.
So this really where we're saying, and this is a quote which says, "Rarely has the need for new ways of thinking been more glaring, from sluggish economic growth and financial instability of the last several years to perennial issues of political upheaval, resource crisis, hunger, poverty, and diseases. People have come to realize that the old ways of doing things will no longer work. Whether one lives in a developed or developing world, whether you're African, whether you're Asian, European, we actually have become an interlinked community. And there needs to be some kind of rules by which we play if we are to make sure that we are able to develop jointly as a human, as human beings. So this slide I've actually tried to explain. Now what is crucial here is us to understand that as we look towards the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goal and measuring the progress thereof, there is one critical aspect of those goals which is really a focus on innovation. And it does acknowledge that without technology and innovation, industrialization will not happen. And without industrialization, obviously, the much needed development will also not happen. So we therefore start to look at the role that innovation can play in what we see every day. And the challenge around innovation is that you actually don't feel its presence, but you actually feel its absence. And all of us here are sitting and quiet and everything is nice. But let there be some kind of disruption in terms of internet connectivity or cell phone reception. We all start to feel that something isn't right. And the issue around innovation is that as much as it becomes part of our lives, it becomes something that we don't feel, but something that we can't live without. And therefore, when we develop the aspects around, for example, how we deal with issues of IP from R&D, we were looking at ensuring that life is made easy with technology to a point that people don't realize that it is actually technology that is making that life easy. So there is therefore a need for us to encourage innovation and entrepreneurship, embrace globalization and multilateral trading processes, support and foster innovation in all forms. And I think here, one of the things that we need to look at is, I know I do see some young faces here, including mine, which I think some of us don't know some of the things on the left. We know mobile phones, but the biggest challenge is that the excitement is not on the gadget itself, but it's on what's inside there. And the biggest fights we have seen recently around intellectual property protection and the costs that have gone towards that has really been focused on what goes inside. Now, I was saying to people very recently that when you look at the actual gadget, I gave an example of an iPhone. I said the iPhone is assembled in China, but it's designed in California. And I said to people in the audience, who do you think is making the most money? The guys that are manufacturing it and you have it is tangible, is here. They manufactured it. Or the guys that have designed. Who is making the most money? We learned last week that Apple has just hit the $1 trillion mark. And all of this thing is really a result of IP. So there's still a lot that we need to do in terms of making sure that we continue to develop. Are we always going to be carrying this gadget? Or maybe in future I'll just raise my hand and start punching on my hands and I make a phone call, or my brain waves will just catch something and do whatever we need to do. So there is still a lot in terms of technology development that we need to carry out. But those kind of developments cannot happen unless there is a system that ensures that intellectual property is actually protected. Now, there's nobody who's going to put their resources and their thinking in generating things while their creative or their creation of minds cannot be protected. So that is really why it is so important for us to respect the issue of intellectual property and make sure that we get those that are generating it to be protected and make sure that they feel that they can be encouraged to continue to be innovative. Now, we have then, I present this as a slide that shows the evolution of the innovation system in South Africa through the eyes of the Department of Science and Technology. When we start to move from the Science and Technology White Paper many years ago, and then we continue to look at the National Research and Development Strategy. But what is crucial here is to see that in 2008, we started moving into identifying the value of IP Act. Now, all the policy documents that you go through from 1996 Science and Technology White Paper up until the 10-year innovation plan, they would have in one way or another made reference to the importance and the value of intellectual property. But it was really after the publishing of the 10-year innovation plan that we decided to have the IP Act for publicly funded R&D and look at various regulations. So this is really what the next couple of slides will really be talking about. So basically the IP Act was to say that there must be more effective utilization of IP emanating from public funded R&D. And as a result of that, the National Intellectual Property Management Office was established. And with it, of course, the IP Fund. And one of the critical things that it needed to do was to establish offices of technology transfer throughout the South African system of innovation. That is all universities, science councils, that they needed to have offices of tech transfer. But the mandate has actually also included other things as well as supporting those who might need advice on IP matters. So again, the emphasis is protection and utilization. As I said, you cannot just protect and not utilize, because that you will never see the value of it by just having it. And then to make sure that, of course, where it is necessary, if we realize that people have just decided to protect and there's no utilization, there is an intervention that we can make. And through that intervention, obviously, is to see how best, who can we get out there, who can actually help us to get that IP utilized. And our preference, for example, in those kind of intervention is to make sure that those entrepreneurs, the smaller enterprises and the BBBE entities actually benefit from this process. Now, have we really made any impact? Has there been any changes since this particular legislation was published? The answer is actually we have seen some positive things here. In terms of IP ownership, previously this was decided upon contractually, so you enter into a contract and depending on your negotiation skills, you may end up getting whatever you can get, or ultimately, if you're bad in negotiating, you probably will end up getting nothing for your creation. And with the changes that has been brought about by the IP Act, the ownership is legislatively prescribed. So there are 3 ownership scenarios, looking at the recipient of the funds that we provide, who undertakes R&D, and then owns the emanating IP. So there's really been a model that prescribes how can you actually do that. In terms of commercialization, R&D outcomes largely ended up in publications and journals. And this is really one thing that we're trying to rebalance. And I'm pleased that we got Prof here sitting, talking, he understands. They are incentivized to publish. And we're trying to say to them, you can actually publish, but before you publish, make sure that you indicate your intentions to protect your IP, so that when you publish, then you also don't lose out. So these 2 things are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they need to be managed. There has to be a specific order of doing things. We are beginning to see that universities in particular are beginning to respond positively to this particular arrangement, where before they publish, they are now starting to consult with their offices of technology transfer and get ideas and advice on how they can actually protect their IP. The benefit sharing in terms of the IP Act was predominantly again managed through contractual basis, and now these institutions legislatively mandated to benefit share. So if you are the IP generator, what sort of percentage can you get, etc. But also what this has enforced or lead into is for higher education institutions and science councils to have their own IP policies. And we have assisted a number of them to develop those. They were not existent in a number of institutions. Of course, we've got some institutions that were quite ahead that had all these policies in place. So the point of technology transfer, therefore, is that it must have an impact. So the knowledge must be generated. There must be disclosure so that it can be protected. Where it is necessary, it must be improved. And after improvement, then we must look at getting into the market and ultimately having the impact. And I'm just going to quickly slide through some of these slides here just to indicate that we have started to see that the institutions are beginning to allocate warm bodies into managing issues of IP, which previously didn't really exist. We are obviously supporting in terms of making sure that some of those capacities are served in terms of salaries, etc. But other institutions have gone on to employ additional resources, so which is quite encouraging. So it is now beginning to become part of the institutional DNA to make sure that the issues of IP are looked into. Of course, in terms of capabilities, this really being a new area, we're seeing that we do not really have highly skilled people in these institutions. So there are still challenges. Some of them are coming in as interns, some of them are researchers, and researchers are not necessarily equipped to deal with issues of IP. So we're still working on improving these areas. And in doing that, we've got courses that we run, for example, with WIPO on an annual basis to develop capacities around issues of IP. So we encourage people to really enroll for this training. They cater for people from all over the world. I mean, we're starting to have people from Asia, from South America, who are part of our annual summer school, which are done with the WIPO. And in terms of the IP registration and disclosures, we are also beginning to see the numbers increasing per billion of the rand invested in R&D. So now that is really encouraging, because as long as people start realizing the value of IP and registering and protecting, when we move into other issues such as making sure that there are proper examinations, etc., so that we don't just really talk about registering any form of IP, but where people will have applied their mind on the kind of IP that they come with then. So we will now start to say we move from dealing with numbers to dealing with issues of qualities. Of course, we can report that the IP transactions have quadrupled over the period that we're measuring this, which is from 2008 up until now. Most transactions yield less than 100,000 rands in terms of licensing, etc. But we hope that this number will grow. And 88% of the revenues accrues to 4 institutions. And that's probably a surprise. Not really. Because, as I said, we do not have, we've got a few research-intensive institutions in South Africa and a few science councils that are doing research. So hopefully with the numbers now, we're starting to see even your universities of Limpopo, University of Venda, University of Zululand starting to register intellectual properties. We also saw the growth in the number of startups that were based on publicly financed IP, and some of those remain operational even after a couple of years. So this is really just a sign. Now, we may want to compare this with the Bayh-Dole Act, which has been in force for a number of years, I think about 30 or so years, more. And here we're talking about just over, it's 10 years this year, because the act was actually came into force in 2008. So we have started this, and we are starting to see signs. In terms of the IP as a tool for socio-economic development, and this presentation will be shared, so I want to really move a little bit faster here. For example, we start to see the impact on certain IPs around the support for TB, and we know that TB is one of the so-called poverty diseases, but the challenge here is that it is one that is ravaging South Africa more than anything else. So, and its combination with HIV and AIDS create very, very significant problems. So having IPs that are actually helping, for example, through the University of Witwatersrand and the spin-out that have come out from there, we are now aware that there are over 78,000 test results that were saved from being inaccurate because of this particular IP. So we really find this quite exciting. This is really just about the propagation of Steriliza, which is quite a challenging thing to do. And Limpopo University has an IP that deals with that. And now we're helping with them to try and upscale their facilities so that they can begin to do more massified propagations. I really want to move to this one as a last example, which I found to be very exciting. A project that deals with sensitizing or warning in terms of rampant shack fires. Now, this is quite crucial. We know that every time, especially in winter, we have ravaging fires in shacks. So with this particular technology, you're able to detect fires before they actually can create the kind of damage that they normally do. And it has been piloted, and I think it's now this work that is looking at massifying its piloting in other areas outside the Western Cape. And this is really where we're saying we've got so many challenges as a country, economically, socially, and otherwise. And we are investing, by our own standards, quite hugely in R&D. And it is important for us to make sure that whatever IP is generated, it is protected so that we can actually make sure that the taxpayers can benefit. Now, it is important to therefore, when we deal with IP matters, to look at ourselves both as the consumers of IP and also as the generators of IP. Now, that creates a very specific dilemma, because you have to respect the IP if you are a generator of IP. And on the other hand, you also need to make sure that there is access to IP, because as I mentioned, there's no value in IP just being nice. It needs to be able to make people's life easier. It needs to make our economies productive. It needs to really make us successful as a nation. So I think we will continue to go through the process now. We are reviewing the IP Act for publicly funded R&D. People are open to make submissions. I think we're going to start that process. We have appointed the various panels that are going to be doing this. And next year, I think it's going to be down in terms of just making sure that those inputs are received and, where possible, incorporated into ensuring that we have a policy that would have learned over the past 10 years of implementation to become a better one, so that we can be an enabling institution as opposed to being an impediment. So this is really what is important. I think if any message you can't take today, one message that you should take is that we are reviewing our IP policy for public funded R&D, and we want you to make inputs. And we will be providing feedback in terms of what kind of inputs we have received and which ones of those we'll be able to probably implement going forward. So IP is actually the gold of today, more than the resources that we have. And as a result, we need to value it, we need to protect it, and we need to make sure that it is utilized. Thank you so much.